going to be the decade of delivery or the decade of action. There were tremendous plans in place to ensure that the Sustainable Development Goals, which were put in place just 5 years ago and have only 10 years left before the 2030 deadline, that this would be the moment when we recapture global attention, when we put a focus on making real progress on these goals. And in fact, not a single country on Earth is really on track to meet those goals, according to experts, including those at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, with whom we're really proud to be partnering to bring this event to you today. I specifically want to call out the SDSN TReNDS, which is the research network that's part of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that really focuses on data and statistics. And this is something you may know about that group. If you read Devex's coverage of the Sustainable Development Goals, we have been on this story because really it's one of the key factors in ensuring that the world does make progress on the SDGs. We need to make sure we have the data to actually know whether or not we're making progress. And that's really what today's event is all about. So I want to shortly bring to you an incredible speaker I think has a unique perspective on this. Our key speaker for today is Francesca Perucci, who not only leads a statistics division at the UN Statistics Division, leads a unit there. She's focused on the Sustainable Development Goals and the stats we need to understand them. And before that, she was focused on the MDGs. So she has a long history of tracking global goals and understanding the data and statistics needed to ensure that we meet them. And we're going to be having a one-on-one conversation and really diving deep on this question of data and statistics for the SDGs. But to get us started, we've got somebody who I can't think of anyone better to hear from on the question of where we stand today on the Sustainable Development Goals and where we're going. And that's, of course, Jeff Sachs. Dr. Jeffrey Sachs is someone I don't really need to introduce to the Devex community. You of course, have followed his work over many, many years in this space. He currently holds a number of titles, including president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and he directs the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he's a university professor. Of course, he's worn many, many hats over the years, but one has been a real leading voice on the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're eager to hear from him on his take on where we stand today and how we actually get beyond the point we're at now and have a real chance of achieving these goals. We've got a small announcement you're going to hear about as we get further into this event. We've got a couple of polls that we're going to bring to you. We want your feedback on some of these questions. And we're going to be taking questions directly from all of you who are joining us from around the world. And thank you again for joining us. We'll be weaving those into the conversation. We'll have some time at the end to get questions directly to Francesca and to Jeff. So please, stay tuned and give us your thoughts as they come up. If you want to follow this on social media, the hashtag is Devex Newsmaker. And we will be looking at Twitter to see what comments and ideas come out there as well. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. And let me just turn it over now to Jeff Sachs.
Raj, thank you very much, and very good to be with everybody. Thanks for having the discussion, and thanks to my colleagues in TReNDS for working together with Devex to put on this event. Well, the Sustainable Development Goals were in a difficult state even before COVID-19, and now they're in increasingly difficult state. But while there have been some recent voices that say we need to modify them or to even drop them or to extend the dates for their achievement, I think that this is basically not the right approach to the SDGs and to the current crisis. The essence of the Sustainable Development Goals is that they are time-bound objectives, mostly to the year 2030. And they're rather specific. For example, SDG 4, that all children should be in school through upper secondary level, or SDG 3, that there should be universal health coverage, and so forth. The real point of the Sustainable Development Goals, in my opinion, is that we should take these targets and their timelines seriously, and we should engage in a specific kind of analytics and policy. My favorite word is pathways. We should ask the question, in a deeply analytical way, and then in a policy and political way, how do you get from here to the goal in 2030? And that's a particular kind of exercise. It is a programming exercise if you're doing it on a mathematical model. It's a spreadsheet exercise if you're doing human resource planning to scale up health or education or infrastructure. It's a public investment question. And then when one looks at a pathway to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, you have to ask a number of questions. What is the policy framework that could drive resources and public policy in the direction to support that pathway of transformation? A very key question is what are the financing needs and who's going to pay for either the public services or the public investments to accomplish these goals. So this is the kind of analysis that I think needs to be done for the SDGs and needs to be done for the Paris Agreement, which is a kind of twin of the SDGs up to the year 2050. We do too little of this kind of analytics and too little of this kind of policy making and too little of this kind of financial planning in general. For some reason, in academic studies, we do analyses or forecasts, but not pathway analysis. I think this is a big mistake, actually, because a lot more analytical work should be devoted to how to achieve a particular objective. It's a control problem in mathematical terms. It is an important analytical problem in development terms. Politics does not usually work this way because our politicians are rarely goal-oriented other than to staying in power, and they're rarely oriented towards goals around 2030 or 2050. Some are, most are not. And the financing rarely works this way because budgets are not, in general, planned on the basis of objectives. They're planned on the basis of increments relative to the current situation. And so in most senses, we don't do the kind of pathway analysis, the pathway policy framework, or the pathway politics and finance to make the SDGs work. So we were not going to achieve them on the trajectory we were on even before COVID-19. Now the whole world has been thrown in a loop, and we've seen exposed how pathetic some of our political leaders are, starting with pathetic leader in chief of the United States and some other similarly disastrous presidents like Bolsonaro in other parts of the world. And this makes everything even harder. So some people say, well, give up. But that is a huge mistake. The analytical question is, could we still achieve the SDGs? And my sense and answer from what I know, based on many decades of doing such pathway analytics, is yes, we could still achieve the SDGs. We could have every child in school by 2030. We could have universal health coverage. We could have everybody with access to renewable energy, especially electrification, as an SDG 7 and so forth. But that's an analytical question, and I would challenge you to explore that in your own national context or in a regional context or a global context. Yes, I believe we can still do this. When you do the financial analysis, you find out that no, a poor country can't do this on its own. But to give up on the SDGs because it's unlikely to be the case misses the point that one of the key missing factors to achieving a pathway is the financing part. And that is especially relevant for poor countries where it should be understood plainly that those countries need financing from the rich countries. And that's part of what a pathway analysis shows. In 2019, the IMF did important work showing that there's a financing gap of between $300 billion and $400 billion a year for 57 low-income developing countries to finance public health and education and other basic infrastructure. But that turns out to be something on the order of about 0.5% of the GDP of the rich countries, standing in the way of fulfilling the financing part of the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't want to give up on mobilizing that amount. I want to keep pounding that this is for a decent world. We need international financing to help poor countries to close otherwise insurmountable financing gaps in their budgets. That's the point. And that's why these goals are important, because they signal what needs to be done by whom, on what timetable to achieve the goals. Let me just close by saying that all of this depends on data. It depends on quality data and depends on accurate and timely data. I would say it depends on real-time data for public management as well as for public accountability. SDSN launched yesterday a new portal, SDGs Please look it up, because I'm going to call on you to help with this. But SDGstoday.org is to provide real-time data on each of the Sustainable Development Goals. Much of these data already exist, but they need to be curated and collated and made available to the SDG community. That's the purpose of SDGs Today, to bring together the remarkable capacities of remote sensing, big data, global data networks that are mobilizing data in real time, whether it's of COVID-19 cases each day, a great contribution of Johns Hopkins and others, whether it is hunger hotspots, which the World Food Program is bringing together each day, whether it is a new data set on daily or weekly emissions of CO2 relevant for climate control, which a network that has recently launched these data has brought together, or other areas. Now, I'm sure that some of you have real-time data or modeling of remote sensing data and so forth for areas such as deforestation or conservation protection or measuring poverty or other distress. And I hope we can work together to help promote your timely data. This is crucial for the pathways, and it's crucial for the management needed between now and 2030 to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Raj, I'll turn it back over to you. I'm eager to hear Francesca and the progress, great progress that the UN is making on worldwide data mobilization.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I knew you were going to give us some provocative thoughts and address head-on some of the issues that were certainly on all of our minds about the SDGs, and we're going to come back to those. I want to remind everybody, Jeff is going to rejoin the conversation after my one-on-one with Francesca, so there's a real opportunity to submit some questions. Lots there to follow up on, lots of threads that I think we can pull on in our conversation. So let me ask Francesca Perucci to please join the discussion. It's great to have you here, Francesca. Again, you have this unique perch, having spent so much of your career focused on the data for the MDGs and now leading the work on the SDGs for the UN Statistics Division. Your formal title there, I'm sure was on the screen, but as Chief of the Development Data and Outreach Branch at the UN Statistics Division. I guess, Jeff talked a bit about how the pandemic has shaped the conversation around the SDGs. From where you sit, how has the pandemic affected this key question of data and statistics for the SDGs?
Yeah, thank you, Raj. Good morning, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation. In particular, thanks to Jessica Espy, Alison Marks, and all the colleagues at SDSN TReNDS with whom I have the pleasure to work and be part of the TReNDS group. Yeah, how has the COVID-19 impacted the development data world? I would say that what we see now is, for the first time, unfortunately it took a pandemic to have this, but the public and the policymakers can really appreciate the value of data. And we see this in real time, how having good data on COVID-19 can both the deaths and the cases and the impact on the various sectors of societies can really make the difference between saving lives or not being able to saving lives. So that really has somehow made the public more aware of how we produce data, how data can really make a difference in people's lives. So now data are more appreciated, are more on, you see it on the screen when we watch the news, there are data there and people pay attention. Statisticians are now, and data experts are working with policymakers. So they have a seat at the table, right? Like we always say, we need statisticians to have a seat at the table when the decisions are made. But the negative aspect, of course, is now that the data are more important than ever before and more urgently needed, we see also an impact of the pandemic on the way the national statistical systems can operate. And if you allow me, perhaps I can share, I have a little slide that summarizes some of the results of a recent survey that we undertook with in collaboration with the World Bank. And we had the first round about a month ago, and we're taking a second round now, and we will do that every 6 weeks, focusing on, you know, assessing how statistical offices and statistical systems can meet the demand for data despite the constraints due to the pandemic. So we see that 96% of NSOs have fully or partially stopped face-to-face data collection, which of course is a serious impact.
And that's an issue we want to come back to in the discussion. I know we've reported on Devex that there is quite a debate in the community, I'm sure you're a part of, about whether to focus mostly on traditional methods or whether to use some new, you know, geospatial, IT-oriented methods for data collection, and how to make those two things complement each other. But that is a stark number, of course, and I guess expected given the lockdowns.
It's expected, and what you see is, well, one thing I want to highlight is that you see in the box to the right, the bottom, the impact on the administrative data sources is less severe. Not in all countries, of course, it depends, you know, how well developed the administrative data systems are in the country, but normally the impact is less severe there. So there
Can you give an example, Francesca? Give an example of a classic administrative data source.
Well, in this case, for instance, with COVID-19, of course, you're looking at civil registration systems. You know, if they're well developed, they can help you.
So, for example, death rates.
Death rates, health systems, you know, how well developed your health systems, the health institutions in the countries are. And there you can see, you know, National Statistical Office is really building collaborations, very close collaborations with the health institutions, and being able to join the data sets and respond to the data demand. Then, of course, not all countries are in that position. But you also see, you know, you stop face-to-face data collection, but as you mentioned, a lot of NSOs are able to supplement that or replace that with phone interviews, web-based interviews, alternative data sources.
And of course, NSO is National Statistical Office, right? For those
sorry, my jargon is terrible. National Statistical Office. We're so used to saying NSOs. But then, of course, you know, you see that funding constraints come in, and countries with limited resources, of course, face the biggest challenge, right? 9 in 10 countries, they in low and lower middle income, they see this impact, you know, of not being able to meet the international reporting requirements, and 6 in 10. need additional support to face COVID-19 challenges. And you see, and we're starting to see already some funding cuts, which of course
and
will
Francesca, how would that have compared to before the pandemic? Because this was a challenge, a longstanding challenge, right? In low and middle income countries, having a lack of funding for their national statistical offices.
Yeah, so yeah, that's the key question. You see that countries that have the skills and the resources and the institutional arrangement to be able to use data sources from different data sets and from different parts of the government and the private sector, they are able to respond to COVID-19. They are able to provide a lot of new solutions, and they've mobilized, they've been very fast, and they've really stepped up, and they can really respond to the data demand they provide. Many countries have set up platforms, for instance, on COVID-19, both on the cases and deaths and on the impact on various sectors of society. But then, of course, countries where the statistical system is poorly developed, that already were lacking resources, they are even falling more behind, and they're struggling to keep up with the demand. These are countries that, for instance, have connectivity issues. We have examples of seriously underfunded countries that before the pandemic could not, for instance, did not have continuous access to internet, or sometimes did not have access to electricity on a continuous basis. They had constant, interruptions. And so those are countries that, of course, are most at risk of being left even further behind, not being able to catch up and provide the data that are urgently needed.
Thank you for sharing that slide. And maybe we can continue our discussion now. And I do want to tell people we're getting questions that are starting to come in, which is great. Feel free to continue that as Francesca gets her video back up on the screen. You're describing the positive side of this, but I wonder about the negative side, because what we hear from lots of implementers in the development space is there's been a flood of interest and a flood of moving of development funding toward COVID response. It sounds like there is a lot of activity in the statistics and data world around the COVID response. Is there a danger that this is going to be pulling funds away from more basic data infrastructure that really is required for all of the SDGs, not just for a health SDG? How do you see that picture? Jeff talked quite a bit about the funding gaps. Talk to us a bit about how you see this, the maybe headwinds in addition to some of the positives coming out of this pandemic.
Yeah, I was really energized and happy to hear Jeffrey Sachs saying we don't give up, right? We need financing, and we need the rich countries to really support countries that need better and more funding. And we certainly need that in data, in statistics, more than perhaps in other sectors. Data and statistics have been largely underfunded. Now, what we see in the SDG report now, the one that was launched just a few weeks ago.
This is the SDG monitoring report.
SDG monitoring report, where we pull together all the official data on SDG indicators. What we see there is that with the ODA, the official development assistance data do not reflect a decrease yet, right? So, and the commitments still seem to be there. So there will be funding. Of course, it remains to be seen. The pandemic is still ongoing, is seriously affecting all countries in the world, including the rich countries. And in fact, some of the richest countries are the most affected currently. And so that will certainly have some impact on the ability and the willingness of countries to continue to support the developing countries and the implementation of the SDGs. Now that, as Jeff was highlighting, is we're launching, a renewed effort, the decade for action, the accelerations. We were all, gearing towards, a new era, the last 10 years, accelerating the implementation and trying to catch up, given the progress was not sufficient to meet the goals. And now we're facing, probably a huge setback even in funding.
Right, there's different kinds of setbacks. We could be facing setbacks in the actual results around those SDG targets because countries fall into recession, people lose jobs, economies collapse, you have maybe increased conflict. Then there's also potentially, as you say, a setback around funding. I wonder, what about the state of data collection, the state of statistics themselves? 5 years after the creation of the SDGs, were we on track in some sense, or how far off track were we in terms of having the basic data we would need across the 169 indicators to know how we're doing?
So no, we were not on track, and we didn't have the data that we needed to not only to measure progress, but also to inform the policies that you need to implement the 2030 agenda. And if you look at the database that we have in the UN Statistics Division on the global indicators, you really see the big data gaps there. And you look at, it's a cube with a lot of empty holes, right? You have a huge number of indicators. We have millions of records, and but we have countries where data are only available up to sometimes 2015 or even older data points. And we have particular areas where data gaps are very serious. There are areas that are the ones where we want to see most progress, where data are lacking. I'm thinking of Goal 5, gender equality, where on average 4 in 10 countries have the data that you need to really monitor progress in the whole goal. And then you have areas like Goal 13, climate change, production and consumption, sustainable production and consumption, Goal 12. Those are areas where you have the most serious data gaps. And those are the core of the agenda, right? They're the essence of the SDGs.
And are those gaps mainly resource gaps? In other words, is it that you look at low-income countries and they simply don't have the resources to invest in those data sets? Or is this a more systemic problem that's not just about the financing, but about maybe political willingness to focus on these issues or data collection challenges? How do you describe why those gaps exist?
Well, there's a long list of issues there, right? I would say, personally, I think the number one is political commitment and lack of resources. We still are not investing enough. I'm not sure where I put the two. They're sort of in parallel, of course. They are linked to each other. There is not enough funding because there is not strong political commitment. There is still not a good understanding of how critical data are to the implementation of the agenda and to development in general and to improving people's lives in all areas. So those are the two most important aspects. You have some of the SDGs, of course, are new in a sense that are new to the statistical world, to the statistical systems. So some of the conceptual and the methodological development is still not there fully. We had, I don't know if some of you might be familiar with the term Tier 3 indicators. Those were the indicators for which the global statistical community had agreed what they wanted to measure. They still didn't know how they wanted to measure it and how they could possibly measure it. So a lot of progress has been made there with new methodologies, with new data sources, partnerships between, for instance, the UN Environment Program has partnered with many new data providers to be able to provide the data that you need to monitor those important areas, on sustainable development, climate change, etc. All the indicators for the environment-related goals, let's say. So there's been development there, but some of these areas are new. The area measuring the vulnerable groups, no one left behind, is the essence and the main principle of the agenda. And data disaggregation has been one of the top areas of the interagency and expert group on SDG indicators. They made that a priority in their work, but still disaggregated data are not a reality. If you browse through our website, our database, you'll see that all the indicators that require a disaggregation by sex, by geographical area, by income group, by people with disability, older people, most of those data are missing. Most of those data are still not collected. And when you
so
go
it's
down,
impossible to have a no one left behind agenda if you don't actually know. If you can't really measure that basic factor.
Absolutely, absolutely. But of course, you have the positive side of the story. All the partnerships that have been established over these last 5 years since the 2030 agenda was launched, the new partnerships with private sector, the role of civil society, those have really helped make tremendous progress in advancing the data agenda overall. And also the international agencies, of course, they're sort of the custodian of these indicators, have tried to promote and support that type of work. And countries themselves have made efforts in that sense.
And I want to ask you one more quick question before we go to a poll for our audience here. Are there opportunities using technology-enabled methods to really leapfrog this current situation, to basically reduce the funding requirement maybe, or using the current funding that we have, using private sector partnerships to more quickly accelerate and close these gaps faster? Is there a real opportunity? Jeff talked about remote sensing technology, for example. Is it a real potential, a real possibility in your mind, or really is this about funding the national statistical offices and getting the basic infrastructure in place? How do you see this?
Well, I think the two go together. You cannot have one without the other. You need the technology, you need to leverage the new data solutions, and that's what we're doing. In fact, we are partners with SDSN and the UN and the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development and the World Bank exactly on that, an initiative that brings the new solutions to countries. It's called the Data for Now. And it was launched last year by the Deputy Secretary General. It had a lot of, it has a lot of visibility. And was just now starting to have some of the funds that we need to implement that initiative. So you need that, certainly, and that can accelerate and also can help us sort of support countries in this process of transformation, modernization. Statistical offices becoming more like coordinators across the whole data system and statistical system. But you also need the funds to build the infrastructure. I just said earlier, you have countries with the National Statistical Office, they have a salary for the staff that hardly pays for their survival, right? There is a huge turnover. You don't have sufficient IT staff, for instance, because of that, because they find a better job that is better paid. There are countries who haven't been able to have a census, a population census in years, in decades. There are countries who never had, a whole well-established program for household surveys and rely entirely on donor-driven or international survey programs. So you need that, and for that you need the funding, and you need the funding at the domestic, at the national level. Again, the political commitment is key there. The government needs to give data the right importance and need to give the adequate funding. And what Jeff was referring to, the rich countries, they have to really support this process and match, the needs.
I know, as Devex has reported as well, there's the importance that the public buys into the data. And so some of the traditional methods are seen by the public as more reliable and credible, maybe, for example, like a whole population census versus a sample set. And so that you have to weigh those two things as well, because the data ultimately, if it's going to move policy and move publics, it has to be seen as credible. Let's get our first poll up. And I appreciate all the many questions coming in, some of which we've been able to touch on, but we'd love to hear all of your take on this question. What's the key ingredient to a more data-driven development and increasing data sharing and open source data, increased capacity building within organizations, or more advocacy around the importance of data for the SDGs? So we'll take a moment here to get everybody's take on that. And I just will give you a chance, Francesca, while people are answering that question, to weigh in a little further. We had a question that's kind of a follow-up to something we already discussed, the key data gaps. You talked about gender disaggregated data. You talked about production and consumption, goal 12. And you talked about climate change. goal 13. Are there any other major data gaps, the glaring gaps that you want to call out?
Well, perhaps the number one gap is that we still have data on extreme poverty that are quite old, and countries are struggling still, what I said earlier, not having well-established household survey programs. They're struggling with having the right data to measure extreme poverty, and we rely, of course, on the international poverty line. What we call extreme poverty is the indicator
$1.90 a day.
$1.90 a day produced by the World Bank, but there is a huge time lag, and so this is an indicator that we're using with the MDGs. And similarly to other areas, even this sort of what I call the well-established indicators are still lacking the data, and they still lack the timeliness for us to be able to assess the trends, right? And to see where we really are.
Yeah, as I was researching that question for my book, I noted that I think according to the World Bank definition, you can still have 3% of the world living in extreme poverty and have met the target because they've purposely left some wiggle room, knowing how difficult it is to get this data and how easily people can move out of poverty and back in, given that it is an arbitrary number. Great point. I appreciate you bringing that up. Let's see the poll results if we can. So it looks like we have a plurality who are focused on capacity building within organizations. And after that, nearly tied are increased data sharing and open source data and more advocacy around the importance of data. I mean, it may be in many ways, all of these are important, and we've given you a question that's impossible to answer, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Francesca.
Well, I like that that was brought up, the open data sources and data sharing. That's key to the work we're doing, and for different reasons. One, of course, to be able to respond to this huge data demand, that is posed by the SDGs, the implementation of the 2030 agenda. You need all these different data sources. You need all these partners, all these different actors. You need private sector. You need civil society. We need to leverage, citizen science. There are so many tools that we now have that we can pull together. But to be able to do that, that's exactly what you need. You need the data interoperability tools. You need to be able to bring the data sets together. You need to be able to share the data. You need to bring users in. We have the data are not utilized enough also. So that's one important aspect, being able to share the data. Open data, that's a whole new movement that finally also the UN has embraced, and it's now a work area of the UN Statistical Commission, which is the highest intergovernmental body in the statistical community. And now we're working on open data policies and practices and developing tools for interoperability. So this all has to happen and to respond to the data demand and make data useful and useful.
Soon we're going to bring Jeff back into the discussion in a few minutes. But one question we got in, I think, is really appropriate for you, Francesca, and I want to bring it to your attention, because you're talking about open source data, you talk about private sector, and somebody out there is saying that, what about ESG metrics, right? You've got billions of dollars among institutional investors being moved into this ESG space, environmental social governance metrics. Is there any opportunity to leverage that data, those metrics? Many of them are quite aligned with SDG goals. Can we use that same growing data set in the same way you talked about private and open source data sources to really drive forward this agenda?
Well, it depends on how you want to use them. Use them for to inform policies, to advocate. All different data sets have different uses, and some are more useful for advocacy, for informing the political debate at the global level, and some are more targeted to really informing policies and change at the national level and local level, right? So it all depends on that, I think.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And of course, a lot of this is targeted to individual companies as opposed to the broader questions. But there's a good point that large amounts of funding are going into that data collection right now. Maybe one last point, which was also highlighted in some of the questions that are coming in, is just how do you think this is going to change? The COVID crisis is going to change the role of NSOs in the long run. Is this just a short-term shift where they're going to be asked to target some of their resources against the pandemic? Or do you think there's any long-term change in the way NSOs work or in their role in governments going forward due to the pandemic?
What I've seen from where I sit, and there's been recently a discussion during the Conference of European Statisticians around these themes, I see national statistical offices have really very rapidly adapted to these new needs, and they've shown that they can step up, and they're also beginning to consider sort of the trade-off between timeliness and you know, having data that are good enough to be used immediately, and understanding, you know, what is fit for purpose. You know, we have to sort of somehow debunk this myth of timeliness, right, of data. Not all data need to be today. For some purposes, you need time series. You need a very rigorous and well-constructed long time series. And you need the granularity, and you need, you know, very complex methodologies or measurement tools. For some other topics and some other areas, you need something that is on a daily basis, like the number of deaths from COVID-19. So there's been a lot being discussed around that, right? What is fit for purpose, and how do you decide how to produce data and how to create, you know, these new partnerships that allow you to respond to the different data demands at these different levels. And I think this is sort of a learning process that we can build on. And as I said in the beginning, you know, the public understands more because they see it in front of them. It's affecting their own lives, in their own families, you know, the COVID-19 deaths. So it's, in a way, it's sad to say, but it is an opportunity. And we can bring these lessons learned during the crisis and make them our best practices on how we want to work from now on. How we collectively, you know, through these partnerships and through bringing these data actors together. This is a huge agenda, and if we don't work together, it doesn't happen.
And we're certainly going to need to see that kind of energy and urgency brought to these issues if we want to have any chance of getting back on track for the SDGs. As you say, we were pretty far off track on data and statistics before this crisis. So if we don't use it, and of course, the idea of using a tragic event like this might sound harsh, but if we don't use it, we're probably not going to get back on track on many other key important goals.
Yeah.
Let's bring Jeff back into the discussion if we can, because we've got a number of questions in that I know people would love to hear your take on as well, Jeff. But first, let me just open it up to you to see if there's anything from the discussion you've heard so far you want to add to.
I just want to mention the phrase "getting back on track." We weren't on track, so it wasn't a matter of getting back on track. It is a matter of getting on track, period, whether it's pre-COVID or post-COVID. The reason we have SDGs, as opposed to just observing the flow of things, is that these are not self-fulfilling goals, nor are they mere forecasts. They are objectives that need a change of politics in order to bring about, and a change of methods and a change of structures. So they're really goals that require a different orientation. As I said in the introduction, a different pathway. And we're not on such a pathway. Of course, the international system is really under assault from the United States, for example. Trump, his administration has been an enemy of all of this stuff. And that is a big difference. I don't want to give up on these goals. I want to get rid of Trump. I'll say, as an American citizen, I will try to vote him out of office in November. But the point is, we weren't on track, because to be on track, we have to be trying. And to understand what is needed, we need to do the analytics. If you want to ask a question, let me put it a different way. I want you to ask the question, what does it take to achieve SDG 3 or SDG 4? In other words, what do you have to do to actually have that be achieved compared to the current path?
And you can't answer that if you don't have the data.
Well, you need the data, and then you need a spreadsheet at least, or you need to be able to do the policy analysis of a dynamic system from 2020 to 2030.
And what do you say, Jeff, to a skeptic? We had one question that came in, which was saying, yeah, but do policymakers even look at this data? I mean, you talked about the political situation in the United States and Brazil. There's so many political headwinds. Does it matter? Are we just talking to ourselves when we collect this data, or is it really influencing policymakers and politicians?
I would say that probably 3/4 of the governments of the world look, and maybe 1/3 of them really take it seriously, and maybe 1/4 of the governments don't look at all. I don't think Trump looks at all. I don't think Bolsonaro looks at all. Although even when I'm, in Brazil dealing with the Brazilian officials, they're telling me how important the SDGs are. That's not something I hear in the US government, but it is something I hear even in the Bolsonaro administration. I take it with a grain of salt. But in many countries of the world, these goals are taken very seriously. In the places that they're taken very seriously, then you could divide again. Some governments actually have a 10-year framework to achieve the goals. Others take them seriously, but don't really have a plan to achieve the goals. And so that's where, again, the hard work of policy analysis is needed. So we're not talking to ourselves. There's a big community of interest. It's not universal. When governments are terrible, as in the United States right now, we have to use politics to try to improve things. And there are many ways to use politics. One is to advocate for different policies of a government, and the other is to try to use the electoral process to get a different government. And typically both are needed. But in many other places, governments are taking this seriously, some making real progress, others saying to me all the time, of course, I'd love to do it, but I need help to do it. I need financing to do it. Mr. Sachs, find me another $50 million this year, and then I'll get the kids in school. That's pretty much a lot of my life, is hearing from governments saying, we'd love to do more, but weren't we promised development aid and so forth? And then I explain to them Trump and all of that reality, and they know it. But this is our fight to get organized to do the consequential things to really achieve what we've said we want to achieve.
Are we being ambitious enough on this point, Jeff? I ask you because you mentioned that 0.5% of GDP of the rich countries is all that's really required. And we're in a moment now where countries like the United States are announcing trillions in economic stimulus. Are we as a development community being ambitious enough and saying, hey, some part of that, a much more significant part than what has been put forward so far, should be put out there for building public health systems, let's say, in the world? I'm not hearing, as I interview leaders, I'm not hearing big numbers being thrown out by even supporters of the SDGs.
Exactly right, Raj, exactly right, because we have a mindset and poor training in our economics classes that you have a budget constraint and you do what's in your budget constraint, and if you can't afford X, Y, and Z, that's just tough. And this is a crazy way to think about resource allocation in the world. Why don't we ask the question today? Actually, I haven't checked this morning's website. Everyone can go on Bloomberg Billionaires Index to find out. But yesterday when I checked, Jeffrey Bezos was worth $190 billion. Okay, one person, $190 billion. Is it a joke? No, it's not a joke. There are people starving to death. There are kids dying because they don't have 80-cent vials of medicines needed to keep them alive. There's no big organizational hassle of getting one to the other, but our institutions charged with that are underfunded. Why aren't we calling Mr. Bezos? Come on, you've had $50 billion of 50 billion. I'm going to say it again because it's just numbing. $50 billion of net worth increase this year in the COVID pandemic because we're all shopping on Amazon. That's obvious. But okay, so Mr. Bezos, you know, you can get by with just 100 billion personally, right? That's what I'm told. You could survive on just 100 billion of net worth. So he's got 90 billion extra, which he could help to achieve the SDGs. Where's our community? Am I missing something?
No, it's a fantastic point. And I would just add to it, Jeff, that you even have those who have signed the Giving Pledge, you know, which pledges to give half their wealth during their life or upon their death. Only 10% of billionaires have signed it. But even those who have signed it aren't necessarily stepping up in a big way. Very few of them have actually announced major commitments prior to the pandemic or during it.
One of the things that this pandemic has accelerated is the inequality of wealth. And this is clearly true because of the underlying technological reality. This pandemic has pushed us into the digital age far faster than, of course, would have been the case before. I'd say on the same trajectory, but we probably had 10 years of push in the last 6 months compared to the pace we were on. Every school in almost, say half the world, let me put it that way, has learned how to go online. Of course, we don't have universal access to such services, so I don't want to be glib about it, but we've had such a dramatic shift to digital economy, and that has led to this paradox that the world economy is in Great Depression, unemployment, and soaring stock markets. This is crazy, but what it reflects is this massive shift of wealth to those who are part of the owners of the digital world, Zuckerberg and Bezos and others. So this is the time for them to step forward and say, yeah, we know we're citizens of planet Earth too, and we are making a major contribution to the SDGs. And for our development community, we need some more ambitious imagination of resource mobilization, because basically too much of the development community says, well, poor countries, you know, it's just out of reach. It was hard, but now it's completely, are you kidding? What's out of reach? We're $150 trillion annual output measured at PPP prices. We have wealth that is absolutely unbelievable. I don't know what the next survey of all the billionaires will show, but it'll be more than $10 trillion, certainly for the 2,000 or so billionaires. Where's the imagination of our development community to say, come on, we need $3 billion a year to get malaria decisively under control, or a few $billion more per year to get 90-90-90 implemented to end the AIDS pandemic, and so forth. This is, I think, the imagination that we need to say, here's the pathway, here's the financing gap, here's where the money is right now. It's not even so much that we need. Let's get this job done.
And this may be that moment, especially given COVID. It's a moment when the whole world is paying attention, as Francesca, as you described, the whole world is paying attention now to data in a way that they didn't before. I wonder what your take is on this question, Francesca. We had a question that came in along the lines of where Jeff is going in his comments about, well, how do we take this energy, this urgency, and direct it toward making real change and investments on data and statistics? Is there a moment here we can capture? How would you address that, Francesca?
Yeah, thank you. I think we are now demonstrating better than ever before because of this crisis, that if we can work together, and if we have the right resources, we can really make it work, and we can really advance the agenda and have data that work for better lives, for better outcomes, for better policies, for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. So this is an opportunity, and we need to. We now have the ears, I think, of the policymakers. So we have to really renew the call for better funding, investing, both at the national level, domestic resources, mobilizing domestic resources, making that choice that data are as important as building the new school. In fact, data will tell you where to build the new school, right? So putting that up on the agenda of policymakers at national level and mobilizing international resources. I think that's where we have to. We have 10 years left, right? If we really are serious about achieving the SDGs, as Jeffrey was saying, it doesn't give up, right? We don't want to give up. Pessimism can kick in. We didn't succeed with the MDGs the way we were expecting to, but I think we still can make it work.
But Francesca,
that's an opportunity.
Yeah, and on the MDGs, we made a huge amount of progress, and because of the MDGs. So I think what we learned from the MDGs is actually when we were able to mobilize that targeted effort and do it in a serious way and have the data behind it, you actually could make it work. You know, some of those big struggles in the early 2000s was, well, could you ever fight AIDS, or could you get malaria under control, or could you do those other things? And we proved the answer is absolutely yes. When the resources are available, the data are available, the modeling is available, and so on, you could make the pieces work, even in very difficult settings. And I did want to mention this one, I think, very interesting real-time data set. You know, it was thanks to Forbes magazine that we began to really understand the billionaire phenomenon, because they started to publish once a year a billionaire tracking. And at least I was a very avid reader of that special issue each year. That's where the money is. But now Bloomberg has a daily website. I encourage everybody to go take a look. It's kind of staggering. Every day they estimate the net worth of the top 500 in the world, and the daily changes. And you know, they do it because they know something about the stock portfolios of these people, and therefore how the daily stock market movement would affect their net worth. And it's quite stunning to watch, but it should open up the imagination as to how much wealth there is in this world that could be deployed at saving lives of newborns, or getting fresh water, or getting kids in school, or other things that are the core of the SDGs. There's no shortage.
And how much more concentrated that wealth is becoming, Jeff, at the top.
Unbelievable, exactly. Absolutely.
We should add that, Jeff, to the goal 10 indicators.
Well, you know, we went to Bloomberg and asked them to put their data set up on our real time. And so far, we haven't succeeded in negotiating that. But this is absolutely, in my opinion, what we should have.
And when you talk about the politics, we had a number of questions that came in on this point about the politics of these issues. How do we drive forward that agenda? That goal 10 on inequality is a key one, because inequality is one of the most important political issues, mobilizing issues all over the world now. And if the data on that is compelling, if people can understand that issue well, maybe it does lead to the kinds of political changes that can unlock progress on all of the SDGs. I am looking at the clock here, and I do want to make sure, Jeff, that we go to you for some closing thoughts.
Yeah, but we're doing it right now. I'll just say one word about inequality. It is striking that more unequal countries are less able to control this pandemic. The fact that the United States is doing so miserably is related to the fact that the US has the most inequality of any high-income OECD country by far. And our inequality shows up as paralysis, it shows up as miserable governance, and so forth. The fact that Brazil is such an unequal country is, in a deep sense, part of its structural crisis that leads to a Bolsonaro, that leads to the disaster that Brazil is experiencing. And if you do some, basic statistics of this, this isn't just picking and choosing. This is really a phenomenon. So SDG 10 is in there for a real reason. Unequal societies are less happy and less able to mobilize, even to save themselves when the crisis arises. The only other thing I would add to this discussion, it's not even adding, it's just reiterating. We have the participants here, Raj, of a community of statisticians, of practitioners in the SDGs, and we really need the creativity of this community. Our new portal, SDGs Today, is an invitation to the community. We've just scratched the surface, I'm sure, but I would like to hear from people. What is your real-time proxies for poverty or real-time indicators for health under SDG 3? We know we measure COVID to some extent day by day. What else can we be measuring day by day? What are you as statisticians or analysts or policy leaders learning and using every day that we should try to incorporate in a statistical portal that is highlighting this work and highlighting the real-time information? Francesca is absolutely right. Real-time, it's not the beginning and the end of everything, but it is a powerful part of the data arsenal because it can tell us where we are. It can say to governments, right now, your forests are burning down and you're responsible, or here are things you need to do to protect vulnerable populations. And that's really the goal of this. So I want to hear from people about that, either directly to me or by going to the website sdgstoday.org and making contact. We have SDGs Today at unsdsn.org is the email address to make contact.
Well, thank you for that, Jeff. And just a big thank you to everyone who has been part of the session today on what is a really key issue. It was going to be a key issue anyway without the pandemic. And as I think you've heard so eloquently from Francesca and from Jeff, it has been elevated due to this pandemic, this issue of data, statistics, trying to eventually get on track for the first time on the SDGs. So it's an issue we at Devex are covering closely. We will continue to do so. Please join me in at least virtually thanking and applauding Francesca Perucci and Jeffrey Sachs for fantastic interventions. We really appreciate your participation today, and be well, everyone.
Thanks to you.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you, Jeff.
Bye-bye. Thank you.